So Tony, welcome back to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. Could you start by, kicking things off, sharing your thoughts on today's topic, the Declaration of Independence and natural law, and then Janine will kick us off with some questions. So thanks for being here.
Sure. Well, Tova, I want to thank you and Janine, the whole Constituting America team for having me, for your sponsors, and for all the viewers out there. You're doing tremendous work. It's another great 90-day study. Pleased to be a part of it. So thank you for having me on. So I thought, since this is helping kick off a discussion of the Declaration, and by the way, happy Independence Day to you and everyone coming up, and it's very appropriate to study this topic at this time of year, and of course, all year long. So I just thought I would start by maybe walking through the Declaration, maybe think about some of the major influences that shaped the Declaration and natural law. I think that as we look at that topic, we go to ancient thought as one of the influences on the Declaration and the American Revolution, the British Constitution and common law, that British tradition of Magna Carta, also the Enlightenment philosophy of John Locke and others. And also the very important strain of Protestant Christianity. These four strains of thought really help to shape the natural law tradition of the Declaration because they all support a version of the natural law tradition. And so I think it's really important to lay out up top, what is the natural law? Well, the natural law is the idea that the universe is governed by certain moral laws, that there's a moral fabric to the universe, that by which we can know good and evil, by which we know what, sin and goodness, vice and virtue, right and wrong. And they're known by both reason, by human reason, but also by revelation and by religion. And I think it's also a reflection upon human nature, that we have reason. We're reasonable beings, all of us. All humans are endowed with reason. We're also moral beings, right? We have a conscience, and I think that's very important to note that this natural law is knowable by reason and revelation. It has a lot of different sources, but it's also a reflection on human nature, as the Declaration, I think, itself is. So how does this all apply to the Declaration? Well, in walking through some of the words of the Declaration, we see in this famous assertion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And how do we know these truths? Well, Jefferson and the Congress calls them self-evident, right? That we have reason to know certain truths, to know certain obvious self-evident truths. Like in geometry, we might know certain axioms and so forth. And so that human reason allows us to know some self-evident truths. Well, what are those self-evident truths? Well, Jefferson and the Congress say that all men are created equal, right? That is one of the most basic foundational self-evident truths. And the question is, how are we equal? Well, I think what they mean is that we're equal because we're made in the image of God, that we have equal dignity, that we're all endowed with reason, and perhaps most importantly, we all have equal natural rights, okay? And Jefferson goes on to say that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And so the idea is that the creator gives us certain rights that no earthly power can take away, whether it's government or whether it's another human being, and that we cannot be separated. We cannot be alienated from those rights, right? They're part of our nature. And I would argue that this supports this idea of this natural rights republicanism, which is at the heart of the Declaration. The Declaration goes on to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And I think this is really important because it shows the moral purpose of government. And what is that purpose? Well, the Declaration clearly articulates the idea that the purpose of government most fundamentally is to protect our rights. Now, it does other things, but it protects our rights. And as the sentence I just read said, it's also rooted upon our consent, right? Our equal consent, that we all have a say. This supports the idea of popular sovereignty and really self-governance, okay? And so it's really at the heart of this natural rights republicanism, okay? And Declaration also goes on to say that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and laying its foundation upon such principles as shall best conduce to their safety and happiness. Now, what is that right of the people? Well, it's the right of resistance, okay, against tyranny. That tyranny has a moral framework, right? It has to be after a long train of abuses, these sort of insufferable abuses of the people's liberties and rights, which are, from their creator. And but there's also a moral framework that says that you would set up a new framework of government, right? So you can't just overthrow the government and just suffer chaos and anarchy and so forth, but you want you want a better government, right? One better suited to achieve its ends, to achieve its purposes, which is the protection of rights. Okay. Now, continuing along in the Declaration, we have a series of grievances. Now, I'm not going to read all of them. We hopefully your readers will go and read the Declaration as part of the study. But I just want to say this about the grievances, that they seem to be a reflection of the natural law, right? Because they're a list of grievances or a list of violations by the British. They're violations of just governance, right? Of just government. And they're also violations of the natural law and of the people's rights, okay? And so all this is bound up together in this sort of logical argument. And finally, in this last summative paragraph of the Declaration, we have, I think, several allusions to this moral fabric, right, to this natural law. One is certainly sort of the right to national independence, to govern ourselves, to have certain powers of government, to achieve our ends. I also think that, the people who wrote this document, allude to God a couple times in this paragraph, which I think is very important and very interesting, because they say not only is there a firm reliance upon divine providence to resist and to form this new nation and this new government, but it also subjects the rectitude of their actions, of their intentions, to what they call the supreme judge of the world. And I think that's very important, because they're saying that it's almost a covenantal aspect of this, right? That these founders are basically saying they're bound by this natural law, right? They're going to subject their intentions to the judgment of the creator. And finally, I think there's this very important mutual pledge, right, of their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. So they're not only sort of covenanting with God to judge their actions, but they're making this pledge to each other, this sacred pledge, almost a covenant, a promise, an agreement with each other, that they're going to pledge their sacred honor and their lives for it. They're laying it all on the line for each other. And so I see that as sort of part and parcel of this natural law and natural rights argument. So I think my 7 minutes or so is up. But I hope that is good fodder for discussion and to evoke some questions about how the Declaration and just how the founding generation in general understood natural law and what they were trying to achieve with the Declaration and even the Constitution is the apple of gold in the frame of silver, in understanding this new order for the ages that they were creating.
Oh, do you want me just to jump in, Tova? Okay, I'll just jump in. I always get to go first. I'm always so excited. Thanks, Tony. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Janine.
Well, it's good. Thank you for lending your expertise to us today. This is a wonderful topic on the cusp of July 4th here. I would love to back up a little bit about so our students that are on can really understand, and the rising generations. Right. We are getting further and further and further away, obviously, from what our founders were experiencing at the time. The norms, the precedents, the beliefs that they had. It's hard for us to even comprehend that. And it's only going to get worse as AI takes over and we all become, metal. It's really, I think it's important to understand what it was like for them. And I love history, so I'm always reading, I just finished a book on John of Gaunt and this whatnot, but they fundamentally believed, and so many people still are under these type of dictators today, which we talk about all the time, billions of people around the world, this is still happening. But all of the world believed at that point that kings were appointed divinely by God. And so when a king then told everybody what to do, it's because they believed that, and they had to all kind of believe this, that God had anointed them and picked them. So whatever they said must be right. And that's hard for us to even comprehend today, that is what they believed. And even in the Magna Carta, correct me if I'm wrong, right? They said, we deserve these rights. But of course, it was for the aristocracy believed they deserved those rights, not everybody. But B, they believed they deserved the rights from the king, that the king needed, or queen needed to give them these rights, not that they came from God. So it would be interesting to explore this. I mean, at a time said it's so hard for us when we think about this, but they believed thunder was God speaking to them. I mean, they didn't really know. Their minds were so different. So to come along, you had these philosophers, Montesquieu and John Locke and all that were slowly kind of coming in and saying, wait a minute, maybe these laws are just, and maybe these rights are innate within us, and that a king doesn't really have the right to tell us what to do. But everybody believed that the king was divinely anointed. In the book that I just finished, when something went wrong, most of the time they didn't really blame the king as much as they blamed the king's advisors. Because the king or the queen, well, they're holy. They're anointed by God. So these advisors must really be messing them up. Now, of course, with King John the Magna Carta, they obviously took the king on occasionally. But on the whole, as my mother loves to say, that's what they believe. So that was a fundamental shift for us to put on paper within a government, not just in a philosophy book, that, wait a minute, we're throwing all this away. So it wasn't just that we took on the biggest country in the world, Britain, which is obviously hard for us to even imagine. We were saying, we're throwing away this whole theory that you're anointed by God. We're not going to believe that anymore. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot there. That's great. Yeah, absolutely correct. That, it was a world of monarchy. It was a world of tyranny. There were no republics, right? And the few republics that had existed in history had not survived very long, right? And had collapsed. And so that is sort of the standard, right? And to live, as you said, in an aristocratic society, one governed by inequality, right, and not by natural rights, but as you said, what the government gave you, right? As Thomas Jefferson said, our rights, though, are not the gift of the chief magistrate, but from God. And so this is a real sea change, right? And so when in the 1760s and 1770s, when Parliament is taxing them without their consent, and the king is imposing his will, yes, with what they thought was a corrupt ministry, right? Corrupt ministers around him. And And then the king, of course, sends navies and armies, right? They're standing armies in Boston and in New York and elsewhere. And then in 1775, this country that we're supposed to be living under their protection, right? And it was the most prosperous empire in the world at the time. So one might say, well, why are we even complaining? But it was the principle of the matter, right? After more than a decade of tyranny and taxes and arbitrary will, right, rather than the will of the people, subjecting yourself to the will of one person who then imposes his will by going to war with his very subjects. Yeah, that does call into question not only the idea of divine right monarchy, but of monarchy itself, right? Thomas Paine's Common Sense does that very much.
The divinity, the coming, sorry to interrupt, but like God coming, they believe that God gave the king, he was speaking to the king, and the king would then have, now there was a fundamental shift to say, no, God is speaking to the people. Right. God is speaking to the people, and the people deserve these rights. I mean, and the people will pick the government. That was just such a huge sea change. And the seed had to be planted because it was, if we look at the things we're trying to accomplish today, if you ever look at movements that take time, they take hundreds of years to accomplish. Let's just say whatever movement you want to imbue in that, the seed is planted, but it takes a long time. So that was just a fundamental seed change that no, wait, we're not going to believe that God gives the king this natural law and these powers. God just gives it to all of us. I'm really struck by how monumental that philosophical sea change was.
Yeah, no, it's a as you say, a fundamental shift into self-government, right? Into having the representatives represent us, do the will of the people, to have this government based upon popular sovereignty, right? Which is just so clearly expressed in "we the people" in the Constitution, but it's also right here in the part of the Declaration I read, right? Based upon the consent of the governed. The king didn't accept this, which is why he went to war with us, right? But it creates a fundamental shift in how human relations are even occurring, right? Or in how we're governing ourselves, how we're making decisions, allowing the people to decide for themselves. This is really transformative. And is really embraced very quickly by the people.
Yeah, and I want to toss to Tova. And it's interesting too to think about the king, because in our minds, we could say, couldn't you see that what you were doing was wrong? I mean, you were passing the people were rebelling, you were passing these laws that weren't fair, and you were acting like a tyrant. But that probably wasn't really his focus at all. It was, wait a minute, I'm divinely appointed, and I get to make these decisions. Y'all aren't divinely appointed. No, you don't get to tell me what to do. I tell you what to do. So it was this principle where it probably blinded him, because I watched so much history and read so much history. These kings were like, no, wait, God's with me, just me. So that was probably why he couldn't see with his blinders on, because it was such a change in philosophy that it was acquiescing. Okay, maybe I don't have all the power. Maybe God isn't speaking to me. God is speaking to the people. And I'll toss it now to Tova, but because I know people want to talk about different things, but I just think that's truly, truly amazing. Don't you?
No, I think real quick, I think you're right. I mean, the idea is that you're subjects, right? And you're going to obey. You're going to do the king's
because
will.
Because God is telling me what to do.
Exactly right. And I also think that, the somewhat of a caveat to that is that kings had an obligation to be just rulers, right? So they had to follow God's natural law in doing what is right and what is just. And according to the founders, he was not doing that, right? These revolutionaries believed that he was acting unjustly, was violating their rights. And so, they saw it as a sacred duty to defend their God-given rights against this unjust king. And he thought that his Christian duty was to rule them, right? So
the king didn't think it was his God, our God, that it was our duty. He thought it was his duty.
Right.
It's our duty to do what he wanted because he was divine by God. I mean, I just think that shift is anyway, I think I'm repeating myself, but it's pretty amazing, isn't it? The seed was planted, and the fact that our founders put that on paper into the form of a government. And you and I love that second line too, that to protect these rights, that these rights are ours. They're not the king's. And so these rights are ours, and we're going to create the government that's going to protect it, and the government and we the people. I think it's all pretty exceptional. And I'm going to pass to Tova now. Thank you, Tony. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for giving that great overview. So now to jump right into my questions. So a big one I have is, so a lot of what you've talked about with regards to natural law is rooted in religion and this idea that like there is a creator that endows us with natural rights. But a lot of Americans nowadays are moving away from religion. 30% don't really identify with any religion. I consider myself to be religious. And so, I could see how the natural law explanation is appealing to people like me, but what is the basis of natural law for somebody who maybe doesn't necessarily believe in a God? Is natural law very like only associated with religion, like it rests on the basis that there is a creator, or is there a framework of natural law that exists sort of without a creator? And what is your take on that?
Yeah, no, it's not only a great question, but an important question. And the idea is that no, natural law is not only for religious people, or is not only in a religious understanding. As I said, sort of it's knowable by human reason and revelation. But, if you don't believe in God, and, when we're talking about that belief in the founding, we are talking about sort of broadly Protestant Christianity, but really sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition. But no, if you look at in the first paragraph, it talks about nature and nature's God. And I think even sort of the words they're using for God, they're talking about creator and supreme judge of the world and so forth. They understand that there's a moral fabric to the universe, and that these laws are maybe no different, even in a non-religious perspective, than, let's say, the laws of Newton, right? And the sort of the mechanical universe, right? The people of the Enlightenment believe that there was this Newtonian universe, but there was also this moral universe, and that one could act according to the ideas of Aristotle and Seneca, and other philosophers too. And not all of the founders were sort of Bible believing Christians either. Some had very unorthodox religious views, or maybe not much of a religious view at all. But they did all believe in this idea of this natural law, this universe. Thomas Jefferson said he got his ideas from Cicero and Aristotle, and others. And so in thinking about these sort of four strains that shaped the founding, we're certainly not limiting ourselves to Protestant Christianity or to a religious worldview. It's really one that understands that human beings have reason. They can discover right and wrong. And part of that moral fabric of the universe includes this idea of rights as human beings, and also includes this idea of self-governance. So that's a really great question. But to sum up, no, you don't have to be religious to understand the founders of natural law.
Great. Well, thank you. And then I was wondering if you could outline what the alternatives to natural law are. So obviously you and Janine talked a bit about sort of the system it came out of, which is that the king can just make laws. But in our modern era, are there other alternative, like legal and philosophical frameworks that are pushed that do not involve the idea of natural law or natural rights?
Right. Well, so we did have the divine right of kings, as you're saying, but more in the modern world, it does become sort of a more secular framework, right? And it becomes more of sort of what's called a positivist view of the world, and sort of man-made laws, right? And we can still talk about justice. I think we can still distinguish between just and unjust laws and good and evil. But I do think that in the modern world, a lot of the confusion has been sown by sort of a denial of natural law, that there is no moral fabric. And my concern is that then human relations are bound less by sort of a shared common moral view of the world or the universe or of human relations, and more of a power relationship. I think in the 20th century, we saw some of the consequences of that. And so, yes, there are other traditions that have shaped our understanding of laws and justice and other principles in the modern world, but not all of them in the end perhaps provide a satisfying answer.
Thank you for that overview. And then another one of my questions is, in our government, we have the principle of natural law, but we also have the principle of democratic rule. And, coming from sort of a monarchy rule, it seems like a democratic system is like a better way to ensure natural rights. But at the same time, there could definitely be situations where the majority might enact laws that violate the natural rights of, a minority of a group of people. And so what happens when, laws enacted by a democratic society do violate the principles of natural law? Is it, I guess, in the eyes of the founders, should it be that natural law is this the most important thing, that if rights are enacted that violate national law or natural law, natural law takes precedence? Or is the will of the majority more important? And then how did they reconcile this in the framework they produced?
Well, another brilliant question. Really, really good. Of course, we have many examples, and Madison had examples in his world where the will of the majority was tyrannical. You can have democratic tyranny, you can have popular tyranny. It's just when the majority acts unjustly, especially towards a minority. An obvious example would be, for example, segregation of African Americans and their inequality. Martin Luther King actually talked a lot about, if you all read his letter from Birmingham jail, he talks about the natural law and how segregation violates that natural law. Now, one does not have to, like King, talk about the natural law. I think it should be part and parcel of our discussions in the public square and in our legislatures and in Congress, for example. We can measure again the justice and the rightness and wrong of certain laws by holding them up to a higher standard, right? And I think that standard, as we understand it, should be described as natural law, or just human conscience, human understanding of right and wrong, of good and evil. And so I think that those should guide our deliberations about our laws and whether we need to change laws. And there's lots of different ways to do that, right? We can do amendments, we can do laws. We can change local law, for example, or state law. So there's lots of different ways. It would depend upon the situation. But I think having that as a part of the discussion, or at least an understanding of this moral fabric, is really important to ascertain the justness of our laws.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very clarifying. And then my last question is regards to this component of the consent of the governed. So this idea that is very foundational to the Declaration of Independence, that if we feel that the government is not upholding our natural laws, we as the people have the right to dissolve the bonds that bind us to the government. But at what point did the founders believe this became necessary? What's the threshold? Because of course you can't have people rebelling or opposing the government for every grievance, or we wouldn't be able to have a society. And the whole basis of a democracy is around rules being instituted that we might disagree with. And of course, if one person sort of rebels against a government, they could be considered a traitor or a terrorist or something like that. But of course, there are other times where it is necessary to, revolt against a government, like the founders did against England. So, at what point, what was the threshold for the founders, or were there different, different founders had different lines of thinking with regards to this? And how do we sort of logically reason our way into deciding when it's time, to oppose the government, and when we sort of have to just suck it up and, just live in the society that is, we were born into?
Another great question. Yeah, no, I mean, so there is I really want to emphasize that there's a really high threshold for going to that level, right? And it's because a couple things. One is, the government is rooted in consent, but the people have to be reasonable, right? They have to be moderate. They have to be prudent. They have to act towards just ends in they and their representatives passing laws. They have to respect majority rule, but minority rights at the same time. And we have, the second point is, people can be led astray by their passions, right? Lincoln warned against this in his Young Men's Lyceum speech, that and sort of a take on Aristotle, that we're usually led astray by our passions, right? By our desires, by our maybe anger, but we should instead sort of revere the law and human reason to modify, to moderate, to quell some of those passions. But thirdly, I think that there are a number of devices which help to mitigate that, which help to calm it, right? Even representation itself sort of helps to, as the founder said in the Federalist Papers, refine and enlarge our views so that, the representatives won't just follow the momentary passions of sort of the mob in deciding their actions. But I mean, and lastly, the idea is that, yeah, you're right. We're going to disagree with some laws, right? We're going to maybe even think they're a little oppressive. Maybe we don't like the person who's president for of this or that party or of a certain administration. That's going to happen. Maybe sometimes we can get really even angry about it if there's sort of a series of laws that we don't like. But I think that we really have to distinguish between just laws and unjust laws, and just maybe something that we disagree with. And I think that if we all approach it with our own sense of moderation and prudence in understanding what's going on, and maybe especially in today's social media world, don't get riled up about every single thing we hear or every single thing that our politicians do. Have a little bit sense of moderation and a little bit maybe more trust in our system, that it will kind of even things out and in the end promote justice. Sometimes we're dissatisfied, and I understand that. Sometimes I am as a citizen. But to actually resist and sort of overthrow the government would be, there's no set of regulations, of course, or written rules about what that threshold is, but it's an extremely high threshold. And I think before we sort of, as they say, grab your pitchforks and torches and march on Washington, that we can all have more of a sense of moderation and believe that our constitutional processes will work. And to overthrow our government, you have to, in the end, believe that you're going to achieve a better outcome, that it's going to be more just, that it's going to be more respectful of our rights. And to be able to achieve that would be extremely and extraordinarily difficult. So I don't think we really want to go there, except as really the most desperate last resort.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for answering all my questions, Tony. Before I toss over to Jewel and Jordan, I just want to acknowledge the students on our chat today. We always like to do that. So Heather Booth is watching with her son, so welcome. And Donna Vitek from the Cushman School has 2 students on. And of course, we also have one of our winners on, Kristen Tokarev. So thank you all so much for being on, and thank you to everyone else for watching too. And now I'll pass on to Jewel and Jordan.
Okay, we got a dense topic I'm sure that our audience has learned so much as all of us have. So first, a question that we'll see how you answer, but our founders, I was always impressed, like almost uh, proud of, like want to emulate that our founders felt the need to justify what they were doing to natural law. And the Declaration is almost like saying this is our best explanation of why this is the right thing to do. And we're going to follow what we believe is right, instead of necessarily trying to just convince people that this is what it is or rile people up. It reads much more like a justification, and almost a wary one. Um, so you comment on that, and then also comment on that they believe that because these rights were that they had these inalienable rights that were being violated, that's what justified the Declaration of Independence. And otherwise, that while there were certain men like Thomas Paine who were attacking the concept of divine right, that all the founders weren't necessarily attacking that right, but possibly were attacking the more of a concept of subsidiarianism, or however you would say it, where it's just that the king shouldn't be so far away, or that if the king was so far away, that they should have members in parliament from the colonies, or these other elements of where they had believed that these rights were violated at these different levels, and that's why we must declare independence. And we're going to set up justification for that, and not just rile the people up to revolt.
Right. Right in the first paragraph, great questions, by the way. I'll take them one at a time. It says we're going to justify to the world, right? We're basically explaining to the world. What I like to call the revolution and founding this great deliberative moment in world history, where they're articulating their understanding of human nature, about the best forms of government, about why certain governments like the British are unjust, and how we can establish sort of a new regime, a new republicanism, new constitutionalism. So you see in all these debates, the debates over independence, the debates over the Constitution at Philadelphia, the debates in over the Constitution, over ratification. In all these moments, they're justifying, they're explaining, they're rationalizing, they're explaining their reasons for why they understand human beings and the world and self-government to follow a certain logic and to have a certain understanding of that fabric of what is just and what is moral, what follows the natural law, really. So hopefully that answers your first question. But secondly, I think as far as your second question, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there was a huge debate over independence in Philadelphia in 1776. Not everyone supported it, right? There were members like John Dickinson and others who thought, yes, the king and parliament are acting unjustly. They're taxing us without our consent. But this can be resolved, even though we're at war, which is pretty incredible, right? We're at war. The British armies and navies are on in our seas and on our land, and quelling us and our rights. But still, we see a possibility of reconciliation, right? And this goes back to the justification, the declaration of the causes of the right to take up arms. But they also send the olive branch petition. Those are both in the summer of 1775. So there's that desire to defend our rights, but there's also that desire among many to reconcile and to be part of the most prosperous and powerful empire in the world at the time. So you're right. Not everyone is rejecting the king or divine right, but certainly Americans are heading in that direction. And they do, in the end, vote for independence, right? And we do split off from Britain. So in the end, that is the answer. But you're right. There was a massive debate and deliberation over this, most especially between Dickinson and John Adams on July 1st in the Congress. And we don't have the records for that. And boy, I would love to go back and read this.
Yeah, it'd make maybe a good, like, a historical fiction. Jordan, you have a question?
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit of a history question for the audience. The timing of the revolution, like really when it started, how long had that king been in power, and when did things start to get so strained? Was it immediately upon him taking power, or was it a gradual happening?
Right, great question for setting this up sort of chronologically and historically. Yeah, really important. So King George III comes to power in 1760, right? Was known to be a just king. And the French and Indian War is going on, right? The 7 Years' War in Europe when he ascends the throne, and yeah, let's not forget that occurs. The British are in massive debt. They are keeping troops on the American frontier to sort of prevent future wars because of that outbreak of the French and Indian War. And so because of that, they're having to pay for these troops and pay for America's defense. And so they feel like as if, because the war was in part fought largely on North American soil, that these colonists living in North America would pay, a little bit of their fair share of the cost of empire. And as George Washington says, yeah, it was only three pence per pound of tea, but it was really the principle. And so we have this sort of series of acts, if you remember from your U.S. history classes, about the Stamp Act, and then the Townshend Acts, and the Tea Act, and then the Coercive Acts and the Boston Tea Party. As the British and Parliament, the Parliament with the King's support is passing these series of taxes, some of which actually, because of colonial boycotts, they withdraw, right? But there's something very important in 1766 after the Stamp Act is revoked. Because of colonial boycotts, the Declaratory Act says Parliament can pass laws basically governing the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That means that, hey, we're suspending this law perhaps, but we have the right to govern you. Okay, we have the right to pass laws in our colonies, on our subjects. And this doesn't really sit very well. And because of that act, you have future taxes that are passed, and the Americans continue to resist. There are boycotts against the Townshend Acts. The most famous against the Tea Act is the Boston Tea Party, of course. And then the Coercive Acts, it shuts down the port of Boston and takes away New England self-government. And does a series of other things, the courts aren't in session. And so these coercive acts really push in 1774, 1775, push the colonies and the British towards war. And as I said, we all know that Lexington and Concord happened April 1775. So war erupts, and it's not for another year and a few months that we actually get to decide upon independence. And I do think that's a pretty incredible thing, right? That we're still, sort of officially British subjects. We're fighting this war. Their armies and navies, as I said, are fighting us, and yet many are still holding out the hope of reconciliation, right? And this is even after the Battle of New York and so forth. So, but eventually we do get to independence, July 4th, 1776.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's time I pass to Kathy or Tova. I'm not exactly sure, for some audience questions.
Well, thank y'all so much for your great questions. And before we go to audience questions, I'm going to jump to Janine real quick. Janine, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. Tony, I was thinking about this wonderful conversation. You said this word deliberation, which I think is so cool. That's kind of what we do here at Civil Civic. We deliberate and think about things, and it's such an important aspect of our country. But it's interesting to me, is it not, Tony, that there were so many that didn't, that's like, do we really have to part from England? I don't really know. But when they wrote that declaration, they didn't give it to another king. Unlike what they ended up doing in France. They got rid of their king, they brought the king back. And I'm like, well, I don't know. We didn't say, okay, we're tired of the king, we're going to create our own king over here in America. They didn't say that. So there was this whole thing, was there not, about, wait, we just don't believe fundamentally, really, it's hard to separate from this big country, and do we really want to be hung later if we don't win? Will we win? I don't know, and maybe we shouldn't leave. We have a lot of good things, but fundamentally there was a sea change, was there not? Because we didn't say, you know what, we don't want King George anymore. We want King of the United States. I think there was just in paper, we put that, wait, we don't even fundamentally believe that you get to create the laws anymore, because we think that they come from, were created by God, and God doesn't just anoint you anymore. We could have had a completely different Declaration of Independence, could we not have?
Yes, I think that's all absolutely right. And note that the Declaration of Independence itself says that, the governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But it doesn't exactly say the type of government you could have, right? I mean, you could set up some kind of constitutional monarchy if you wanted. I mean, it doesn't exactly describe it. In America, though, I think that as you're saying, that transformative movement was towards a constitutional republic, was towards people governing themselves locally, as well as in their state legislatures, state governments, and then some form of government, some Republican constitutional government at the national level, binding all of us together in national union, which is what.
But if we had just wanted a Republican form of government under a king, like a constitutional monarchy, like they have in England now, we wouldn't have said we are given our rights by our creator. It was fundamentally saying, you, the king, do not give us our rights.
Right. It does shift. The Americans really embrace that aspect and really shift towards that.
Because the king's only justification was that God has justified me to do this. And if you take that away from a king, he has no more power.
Right. And as I said earlier, the king supposedly, in early modern Europe, had to respect natural law, had to, to the extent that they understood natural rights as the Enlightenment kind of developed, he had to respect those. But we know that it really became just an act of arbitrary will. And that was the real problem, is that these kings were not respecting, in their divine right monarchies, were not respecting natural law, were not respecting natural rights, just imposing their will upon the people.
Well, they still believed they were endowed by God to be these rulers.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And this actually leads into an audience question from one of our students who's watching with us today. What is the difference between a republic and a democracy, and how are those impacted by natural law?
Mm-hmm. Right. And we use both of those terms somewhat interchangeably. I try to always call us a republic, because a democracy, perhaps in its purest form, would be more like ancient Greece, where the people actually sit down and gather and decide upon their laws, right? A republic implies representation, that you're going to give your consent to these representatives to represent your will, but with reason and moderation. So if the people want to do something unjust, you're exercising your prerogative to sort of filter that will. But that would be, the most fundamental difference. But I don't think, we call ourselves a democracy, right? And sort of Lincoln described as government of the people, by the people, for the people. And I think it's pretty accurate. I think what people mean just generally, broadly, is self-governance, right? Is self-government and popular sovereignty, that we have the ultimate authority in this country, and that we give our representatives, we give our government leaders our consent to govern us justly and to protect our rights.
Well, thank you. And that question came from John Booth. And we also want to take a minute to give a shout out to our listeners on Las Vegas KKVV 1060 AM. They air our podcasts every Monday night at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to KKVV. And Tony, Robert Zimmerman asked, was George Washington really offered to be king, or was that a myth?
It's a myth to a certain degree, right? He is given dictatorial powers twice during the Revolutionary War. He only exercises them briefly once, and always deferred to the civilian government. and was very adamant about not becoming a king. In fact, he didn't even really want to be president. He very reluctantly understands his own indispensability as the first president, and understand his country is calling upon him and needs him to serve as the first president, and he does. He wanted to retire after one term, but he again reluctantly sort of answers the call of his country for that second term. But I think he resigns purposefully after that, because he doesn't want to become a king, because he does want rotation in office, because he understands that he's not going to be around forever, and that other people are going to have to take up the reins of the government, and become president, and become other members serving in the national and local and state governments. And so he understands his own indispensability, but he also understands that a republic is fundamentally a government of laws and not of men. And I think for Washington, that's what it comes down to. He
Well,
could have
thank
served
you.
for life, though, but he didn't. That's right.
Well, thank you. And that's a great way to wrap it up. We are right at the top of the hour, and we want to thank you so much for being our guest on today's episode. And we want to remind everyone that we do have a 90-day study, 90-day online study going on right now on First Principles of the American Founding. And you can sign up for daily emails on our website. You can read the day's essay every day on our website, or look at the whole schedule and read the ones you're most interested in. So, Tony, we thank you so much for your time. We also want to remind our audience that next week is Independence Day, Tuesday, July 4th. So we're going to not have a podcast on that day, but we will be back with you on Tuesday, July 11th. And we look forward to seeing everyone then. And
I just want to ask one quick thing. Tony, do you really think everybody would have said George Washington king? I think there was still a philosophy there that didn't want kings. So there may have been a few people, but I don't know that really he really could have become king.
Right. I mean, I think that if he had wanted to serve
That was
until he
open
died,
for debate, really, right? I mean,
yeah,
they
no, I
would have
mean,
had to debated that.
yeah, there were still three branches of government, and all that. So he couldn't have been a king, but he could have been president for life, which effectively sort of could have been that. But he could not impose his will arbitrarily because of the constitutional order that was established in Philadelphia. So certainly he could not exercise those powers, but he could have served for life if he wanted.
Yeah, good old George Washington. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you,
Thank you.
Tara. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jill and Jordan and Aubrey. Tony, great
Thank
job.
you, Janine, and everyone. Appreciate it.
Bye.